She shuffled into the bank with a small, fraying plastic bag slung over one shoulder, and a tiredness that seemed to live in the hollows of her face. The fluorescent lights made everything a little too sharp, the marble floors echoed, and people glanced up, did quick mental arithmetic about where she belonged in the world. Someone muttered that she looked like she might ask for spare change. A security guard crossed his arms and watched. She moved slowly to the counter, every step deliberate, as if she was measuring the distance between hope and reality. Her coat was thin, threadbare at the cuffs, and a knit scarf that had seen better winters was wrapped around her neck. Her hair, once dark, had gone silver, and a deep, stubborn light in her eyes refused to be dimmed by whatever life had been thrown at her. The teller at the window smiled out of habit, polite but distant, the sort of smile that keeps a safe social distance. She asked for a basic transaction, her voice small but clear. One of the onlookers snickered when the teller asked for ID. How could she have an ID, they whispered. Homeless people didn't carry things like that. Another person stepped back, making a wide berth as if poverty were contagious. Phones came out. Someone whispered the word viral as if humiliation were a show and they had a front row seat. She slid a small stamped envelope across the counter. Inside were a handful of crumpled bills, maybe a few dollars more than pocket change. She asked quietly if she could cash it. The teller hesitated, eyes flicking toward the manager, then signaled that it would be fine. While the transaction was being processed, a man sat at a nearby table sipping an expensive coffee. He wore an ordinary jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. To the casual observer, he was just another customer, but he watched her with an intensity that the others missed. He noticed the way her hands trembled as she counted the money, the careful, practiced motion of a woman who had learned to stretch every cent, who had measured each meal the way a ship measures rations before a long journey. The terminal beeped. The teller placed the cash and the stamped envelope back into her hands. When she stepped away from the counter, a few people scooted closer, curious to see where this would end. One of them pretended to drop a bag, then patted her back dramatically as if to anchor their audience status. Someone else made a video, whispering commentary to a friend about how desperate people made for the best entertainment. Outside, the city street had its usual noise. Cars, horns, a dog that looked like it had memorized every sidewalk it had ever walked on. She sat on the low wall near the bank, and the thrift of the wind cut through her scarf. She opened the stamped envelope and stared at the bills as if they were a lifeline. A small boy ran past, chasing laughter, and for a rare second she watched him with a softness that made the corner of her mouth lift. The man finished his coffee and walked over. He kept his hat low, hands in his pockets, careful to keep his steps calm. He sat down at a respectful distance and watched her count. She didn't look up. People around them were still talking about her, their voices low and cruel, but the man's presence was steady, a quiet counterpoint. He gestured toward the food cart across the street and asked if she would like something warm. She blinked, surprised. No one really offered anything more than scorn. She motioned a no, humble and automatic, but his insistence was gentle. She stood and they crossed the street together. The vendor wrapped something warm in paper and slid it into a bag as if it were routine. The man paid for it without fanfare. They sat on a bench near the fountain and watched the world go by. He asked about her name. She said it with the kind of pause people give when they don't expect memory to matter anymore. He told her his was James. She smiled politely, a gesture of politeness that came from survival. He asked about family. She said she had lost touch with them many years ago. He asked where she slept. She gestured vaguely toward a shelter and shrugged. He listened without judgment. People rarely listen when they think they already understand. The man learned things in those minutes as if flipping through a slim, folded map of her life. She had been a seamstress once, she said. She had worked in a small shop that smelled of thread and cotton and steam. There had been a husband who loved the piano, and a little girl who sang in the bath. Life had a way of rearranging itself until faces slipped like coins down drain holes. When she spoke of the little girl, something in her voice changed. For a moment the grief was bright and immediate. She had letters once, tuckered and folded all in a trunk, but there had been shifts, then arguments, then the contract of life had simply been torn. Her hands, the man noticed, trembled less when she recalled the seams she had made for that child, the neat, stubborn stitches that held a garment like a promise. James asked if it would be okay to help, the way people ask when they give charity and want to be seen for their kindness. She laughed softly, a laugh that tasted of having been offered pity one too many times. She said she didn't want charity, she wanted a chance. He promised he could try to offer that chance. He did not take her to a shelter, and he did not hand her a single card with a number on it. He took her to his small office not far from the bank, a modest suite with wide windows and the soft hum of a city that was awake and busy. He made her tea himself, quietly, like someone who had once learned the habit out of necessity. He sat opposite her, and they talked until the sun warmed the glass and the city softened into late afternoon. He learned small, practical things about her situation that were quietly heartbreaking. She had a dental problem that made chewing difficult. Her glasses were badly scratched. There was a debt she kept between her and a woman who had once promised help and then disappeared. She had skills too. Sewing, mending things, a patience that translated into care. James listened, and then he asked if she would let him help with small steps. He explained that sometimes. Opportunities were built not from grand gestures, but from small practical things: a doctor's appointment, a new pair of glasses, the replacement of a broken tooth. She took it as a kindness, then as a tangible offer. Her eyes filled, not with tears exactly, but with a quiet astonishment that someone might see the person under the tattered coat. The days that followed were slow and careful. James left a number with her in a way that didn't humiliate, a paper folded into the seam of her scarf. He had an assistant set up appointments under a discreet account. He paid for a dental consult and arranged for the cost to be covered. He bought new glasses that fit properly and a repair kit for her coat. He didn't announce any of it. The bank's gossip mill kept grinding, oblivious to the quiet work happening somewhere else. She began to arrive at the office a few days a week, not as a charity case, but as someone who had something to offer. James introduced her to a small tailoring program with an old friend, a workshop that took in people who wanted to relearn the trade and re-enter the workforce. It was a modest room full of machines that whirred and hummed, and the people there treated her with a kind of practical respect that made her shoulders unclench. Her hands returned to their old rhythm. She fitted seams and pressed collars. There was laughter and quiet compliments. She taught younger people the fine stitch, the way to hold a hem so that it would lie flat and honest. She was given a small stipend for her work, the first steady money she had held in months that felt like her own. Outside, the people who had laughed at the bank still told the story with relish, because gossip is sticky, but the details of her life no longer fit the punchline they'd written. The woman who had been a laugh track became a person in a workshop, a presence that drew students and customers alike. She repaired coats for new mothers, sewed hems for men who worked nights, and stitched small things with a care that turned ordinary garments into quiet statements of dignity. One morning, the city woke to a headline about James Carter, a businessman known for his property developments. He had been in the news before, but nothing sensational that morning. He walked into the workshop wearing the same hat and jacket he'd had when they'd first met. The room went quiet in a way that made the machines sound louder. He told the group he had an idea for a program that could give people stable work and a chance to retrain. They asked for funding. He said he had already started. They asked why he did it. He smiled and said he believed in work that returned dignity. People cheered politely, some out of gratitude, some out of hope, some out of confusion. He looked at her and said that everything had started when he'd met a woman who reminded him of his mother. A reporter from a local outlet walked into the shop with a microphone and asked if they could interview her. She paused, hands resting on a finished coat, and glanced at James, who nodded. She spoke into the microphone with a voice that fit every story her life had to tell. She spoke of the seam that had been stretched too thin, of the stitch that had snapped and been repaired, of the small moments of kindness that added up like careful rows of thread. The reporter asked what she wanted people to know. She said she didn't want pity. She said she wanted opportunities and to be treated like someone with value. She said that when people laughed at someone like her, they were laughing at the easy story they told themselves to feel better, not at the truth. The story ran on the evening news. The video showed her hands, working, the machines and the hum, and a face that had been softened by care. The comments poured in with the reach of 1,000 small echoes. Some were kind and full of thanks. Others were still cruel. But somewhere in the middle, people were moved. A local store offered materials. A former neighbor recognized her and offered a room. An old friend came forward with a letter and a tearful apology. The small stipend grew into regular work. One day a letter arrived addressed simply to her, the ink shaky but deliberate. Inside was a folded photograph of a little girl with a crooked smile, holding a worn teddy bear. On the back a single line, "I'm sorry." The girl had grown up, lived a life, found her own path, and now wanted to know the woman who had sewn her coats. The photograph was a key, and the key fit into a lock that had been rusted shut for decades. They arranged a meeting at a small cafe that smelled of coffee and the faint sweetness of pastries. When she walked in, the woman in the photograph stood, and the world narrowed to the two figures. They embraced like two halves of a map finally laid together. Tears came, and the old woman laughed with a sound that had only ever been broken once, now repaired with new threads. The workshop thrived and the program expanded. James walked with less secrecy and more quiet purpose. He started to host community days where people could learn mending, sewing, how to repair a zipper without it becoming an act of frustration, how to fold a shirt so it looked new. He made sure the work paid fairly and that people who came through the program could connect with employers who valued their skills. The woman, now known as Rosa, took on an apprentice who reminded her of the girl she used to be. She taught the child the patient art of turning fabric into something useful. She told stories about the music of a sewing machine and the difference between a stitch made with love and a stitch made out of necessity. Her hands, once curled around the edges of survival, became the hands of a teacher. Years later, when the program had found its rhythm and the shop windows were full of repaired garments and new designs with little sewn-in tags that said "Made with Care," James organized a small celebration. He invited the people from the banks, the gossips, the reporters, and the students who had walked into the workshop knowing nothing and left with a skill. He asked Rosa to say a few words. She stood before them, hands steady, and spoke not about herself, but about what had happened when people chose to listen. She spoke about dignity and how it could be restored in small acts. She thanked James softly as if gratitude itself were a fabric that needed careful folding. She told the room it wasn't enough to notice suffering. It was necessary to act without making the one who suffered feel smaller for it. At the end of the celebration, James took off his cap and walked over to the bank where they had all laughed. He stood in the lobby in plain clothes and asked for the manager. He told the manager he wanted to start a fund to train people and to help those who had been ignored. The manager looked at him, eyes narrowed by a workday of protocols and policies, and then something in his expression softened. He had seen the headlines. The bank's public relations team contacted him to set up a program, and a small partnership grew where community training and job notices were posted in that very lobby. Rosa's life didn't become a fairy tale overnight. There were bad days and setbacks and the kind of bureaucratic snags that make hope feel like walking through molasses. But she had a steady paycheck, a place to sleep that was warm and safe, and a community that saw her value. She received letters from that little girl who had become a woman, and they built a new relationship with care, not expectation. One evening, as the sun set and painted the city in a soft golden light, Rosa sat by the window and watched the street below. She thought of the man with the baseball cap, the way he had looked at her not like a spectacle, but like the person she had always been. She smiled and mended a coat while the radio played a song about coming home. Outside, someone walked by and went on with their day. Inside, in a small shop lit by warm lights, someone stitched a little piece of the world back together. The truth of it was simple and stubborn. Kindness that does not humiliate is the kind that heals. Opportunities built on respect last longer than pity. People who are counted out by the world are often waiting for a hand that will offer work, not charity. When the world saw her once as a spectacle, it missed the woman who could teach and fix and keep a seam true. When the world finally looked, really looked, the laughter stopped and something better took its place. In time, the bank's lobby became a place where a poster announced free sewing classes and job notices. The people who had once gathered to sneer now stopped and read, and some signed up. The cycles of scorn broke into small acts that looked suspiciously like community. Rosa kept teaching, kept mending, and kept living with the clear eyes of someone who had been given a second chance and had decided to use it well. Her scars became lines of wisdom, and her laughter filled the shop like the final stitch in a long repair. When her apprentice's first coat was accepted by a local boutique, she cried, the sound of it full and unashamed. The city kept moving around them, indifferent to many things, but the little shop remained a pocket of steady warmth. People would sometimes stare at Rosa when they first met her, and then realize, slowly, that the woman they saw had always been there, only that no one had bothered to see. They learned to look. They learned that sometimes the richest person in the room is the one who knows how to mend. Years later, sitting at a table with a cup of tea, a photo of her and the woman who had been her daughter smiling. Back at them, Rosa would sometimes whisper a thanks into the quiet, not just for the money or the work, but for the restoration of a thing that had been taken from her long ago, the sense that she mattered. And for James, the man in the jacket and cap, there was a stillness that came with knowing his fortune had been put to the use it was meant for. Not in a headline, but in the slow, honest, stitch-by-stitch work of a small shop. Hope grew, stitch by stitch, and she rebuilt her life again.